ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hey, Jules and Jez here. This week on Not Stupid, Sam Kerr is found not guilty in a court in London.
So is it a slur to call someone white? And what was this case actually about?
Depends on the intent, Jules. You can hear Not Stupid on the ABC Listen app.
Hello, it's Sam Hawley here. We're continuing to work behind the scenes on a special series all about the housing crisis. Last week, we asked you to send us a voice memo on who you blame for the housing crisis, and thanks for all your great responses. Now, we want you to tell us how the cost of housing is affecting your life. Is it holding you back from starting a family, leaving you short of cash for medical appointments, trapping you in an awful commute? We want to hear your voice on the podcast, so please send us a very short voice note that you record on your phone and send it via email to abcnewsdaily@abc.net.au. Now to today's episode. Donald Trump says negotiations to end the war in Ukraine have begun, but on whose terms? The US president chose to call the instigator of the war, Vladimir Putin, first to discuss a potential deal, raising fears he'll push Ukraine to the sidelines. Today, Rajan Menon from the City College of New York on what peace might look like under Trump. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily.
Donald Trump has held back-to-back calls with both Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Ukrainian leader to bring an end to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
I think we're on the way to getting peace. I think President Putin wants peace and President Zelensky wants peace, and I want peace. I just want to see people stop getting killed.
Mr. Trump praised the Russian leader and said they've agreed to work closely together and visit each other's nations. A Kremlin official said the call between the two lasted an hour and a half.
President Putin wants to have peace now, and that's good. And he didn't want to have peace with Biden.
Rajan, Donald Trump said he would end the war in Ukraine on day one of his presidency, which clearly has not happened. But we are getting a better sense now of how he plans to resolve this conflict. Just tell me about this call that he had with Vladimir Putin, first of all.
Right. First, on his promise to end it on day one, that is the kind of hyperbole that we've all now become used to. Mm-hmm. But there's no question that from the beginning, Trump has felt that this is not America's war. It principally is a matter for the Europeans, that the U.S. has been by far the largest provider of military aid to Ukraine, about $65 billion, more than everybody else put together, and that he wants to end this. And he thinks that if he talks to Putin, they can come to an agreement. Now, one thing that's changed here is that although he has already spoken to Putin, the understanding we have is that he subsequently then talked to Zelensky. So Zelensky hasn't been cut out of this.
It's important, though, isn't it, to note that the US president chose to speak to the aggressor, that is Vladimir Putin, who started the war, first,
Correct,
rather than the Ukrainian president. So what do we read into that?
You know, he's always had, I think, a soft spot, maybe not the way to put it, but he's always had this feeling that he and Putin are tough guys. He's had the same attitude toward Xi Jinping and then Kim Jong-un of North Korea, that they can sit down and they both understand each other, they know the realities and the arithmetic of power, and they can arrive at a deal, and all of the small fry will then simply have to accept what's done.
Well, the US Secretary of Defence, Pete Hegseth, he was speaking at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, where he said Ukraine cannot join NATO.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
And he says it's unrealistic that Ukraine could restore its previous borders.
But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering.
That doesn't sound good for Ukraine.
No, just to add though, Sam, I'm, as you know from our past conversations, quite sympathetic to Ukraine's predicament. I think it was invaded unfairly and needlessly. But I realize, and just about everybody that Pete Hegseth spoke to realizes now, that the idea that Ukraine can oust Russia from the territories that it seized since the invasion of 2022 is not on the cards, let alone going back to the 2014 lines. So the real question would be, how are the lines be drawn? What kind of leverage can Ukraine extract from the fact that the Russian army, we have lots of evidence, is getting weary, plus the Ukrainians are still ensconced in a large chunk of this province called Kursk inside Russia. If they stay there, can they use that for leverage? So the question is, what will be the demarcations? Now, Putin says, I want all four provinces, which is to say Donetsk province, Lugansk province, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. He controls fully only one of them, namely Lugansk. So if he's asking for the provinces, only part of which he controls, that would be an extravagant ask. And one would hope that the president would say, no, I can't accept that.
And he wants to keep, of course, Crimea, which, as you mentioned, he took in 2014. So speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, President Trump was insisting that, in fact, it was Ukraine that has to make peace. He says it was not a good war to go into.
Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
It's an interesting question. I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace.
We will continue
I said that was not a good war to go into.
But, it's in some way Ukraine's fault.
Yeah, we have to ask who started massing troops and who invaded whom. It's very clear that Ukraine didn't invade Russia, so I'm not quite sure what to make of that. But I think the broader point, to put the most charitable interpretation of what he's saying, is that Ukraine is the weaker party here. It's dependent on American aid. That aid would not continue forever, and therefore Ukraine is in a weak position and has to make a peace on that basis. Now, that's stating the reality rather brutally, but that's a more charitable interpretation than saying he meant that, well, Ukraine is somehow responsible for the war. Now, he may think so, I don't know. It's very hard sometimes to parse the president's language.
Yes, that's certainly true. Ukraine, though, Rajan, has always said it will not give up its land. And on the ABC, Inna Sovsun, she's a member of the Ukrainian parliament, she's one who is incredibly worried that that will happen, that they will actually give up this land that thousands of people have died to protect.
We still do not understand why we should be making concessions. We have been within our rights protecting ourselves. We have been attacked by a foreign state. And we are, I would say, rather disappointed that unfortunately the military aid that we have been asking for was not sufficient.
Yes, indeed, that is the great worry. I'm in touch with friends in Ukraine periodically, and they're all worried about it. What will be the reaction if Zelensky says at some point, we're prepared to concede? My own sense is Zelensky won't say anything, and that as the negotiations unfold, he will see who has what to bargain with. And I think what he might say is, well, we accept the fact that, and I'm not speaking for him, obviously, but I can imagine him saying, we accept the fact that you now control certain amounts of our territory. We will never recognize the legality of that, but we are prepared to sign an end of the war agreement and agree not to resume the war to end the fighting. I myself do not believe that the Russians are completely holding a strong hand so that they can dictate the terms of the peace. There is increasing evidence about the cost of the Russian economy, They have lost something like 800,000 people dead and wounded. The losses in armor and artillery have been astonishing, given that Ukraine is the weaker party here. But what I think doesn't matter, it really is what President Trump thinks, and it matters because nobody can replace the United States as a supplier of arms.
Trump has said the negotiating team will include the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the CIA Director, John Ratcliffe, and others. How are they placed to negotiate something quite complex like this?
It's going to be complicated for them because, Putin knows the issues very well. He's whatever one may think of him, he's not a stupid person by a long shot. Zelensky is a very capable person. He's got very good staff. And so they will have to come up to speed. I mean, many of the Americans who've just come in may have very great difficulty, pointing 3 towns out in Donetsk, for example.
Yes.
It is entirely possible, Sam, that even if there are talks that Zelensky might say, I'm not going to sign a deal, and that the war will drag on for perhaps even the rest of this year. I'm not saying that will happen, but I wouldn't automatically assume that Ukraine will just lie down and play dead and refuse to fight, because they have everything at stake. For them, it is a question of national survival. This is not a question of national survival for Russia. So the asymmetry of stakes here is different, as between Ukraine and Russia. The asymmetry of power, of course, favors Russia.
Well, Rajan, let's then speculate on any future peace agreement. Would there need to be an international peacekeeping force or foreign soldiers on the ground of some sort to maintain that peace? And who would step up to that role?
Right. So the Europeans have said that, they would do it. And I think the figure of something like 200,000 troops has been mentioned. This was an idea proposed some months ago, as you will recall, by Macron, the French president. There are military experts who believe that 200,000 troops is not enough. There will need to be 500,000. And even if 200,000 is all that can be had, what is their function? Is it to keep the peace, which means how will they keep it? Is it to serve as a switch where if Putin invades, they'll be the first line of defense and the cavalry will come in, and where will that cavalry come from? Or is it the expectation that 200,000 people will be enough of a deterrence? Or further, is it the expectation that 200,000 people plus the Ukrainian army can defeat Russia? My own feeling about this is that the Russians have been through a war now which is going to last at the minimum for 3 years. And it has cost them dearly in blood and treasure. Putin is in his 70s. He's not going to last very long. One has to ask oneself, looking down the road, if there were another Russian leader, would he, or conceivably she, look at Ukraine and say, do I want to repeat this experiment again, run this experiment again, and for what? So I would think that this experience, no matter what the bravado of the Russians, has had to have a sobering effect. Now, that's easy for me to say. I'm not sure many Ukrainians would be reassured by that.
All right. Well, since the war broke out, of course, in Ukraine, the Western world really has tried to isolate Vladimir Putin. Now it's like Trump's embracing him. So what message, Rajan, does that send?
Well, it raises the question of whether, as part of the deal, and before Putin has really delivered much of anything, he will ask for and receive a lifting of sanctions. The Russians really want this. And just before President Joe Biden left office, he added to the sanctions, especially on the Russian oil industry, right? So that's really the question. There's no doubt in my mind that that will be on the table, and Putin will want that. Now, the question is, if there's a sequence of events to happen to reach an outcome, will this business of lifting sanctions be done in concert with Europe at the end of the process? Or will it be offered up to Putin as a gesture of goodwill, or just simply because the president seems to like Putin.
Well, Donald Trump says he and Putin may meet perhaps in Saudi Arabia in the not too distant future.
We're going to meet also probably in Saudi Arabia. The first time we'll meet in Saudi Arabia, see if we can get something done. But we want to end that war. That war is a disaster. It's a really bloody, horrible war.
What do you think then, Rajan? Can Trump actually pull this off, actually end the war in Ukraine, do you think?
Oh, he can end it in a minute if he were to agree to Putin's terms, right? Even if he didn't give him all 4 provinces, saying, look, Vladimir, you don't control all 4 of them, but I'm prepared to have an agreement where I coerce Zelensky. I mean, he wouldn't put it that ham-handedly, that I coerce Zelensky into giving you all the territories you now control and insist that the Ukrainians withdraw from Kursk, this part of the province in Russia that the Ukrainians now still hold. He could end the war. I mean, Putin's perfectly happy to end the war. He doesn't want to fight for the sake of fighting. He will end the war if there's an offer on the table that he can take home and say, see, all of this was worth it.
Rajan Menon is a Professor Emeritus of International Relations at the City College of New York and a Senior Research Fellow at Columbia University's Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Cara Jensen-McKinnon. Audio production by Adair Shepherd and Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again on Monday. Thanks for listening.